the benefit of starting a podcast, it goes beyond just yourself as the host or maybe even growing your business, but to give your audience, to give your guests on the show an opportunity to reach people that they wouldn't have without you. And you just need to start this thing.
Welcome to Podcast Coaching for Kingdom Entrepreneurs. I'm Kristen Fields Chadwick, your podcast coach on this transformative podcasting journey. Our mission: empower Kingdom entrepreneurs to confidently launch and grow podcasts, fostering a journey of being seen, being heard, being known, and making a lasting kingdom impact. This is Podcast Coaching for Kingdom Entrepreneurs. Your voice matters. Hey everyone, welcome back. All right. I love sharing other podcasters' stories and their journey. And so today I have Justin Thomas on the show with us today. And he has his own podcast, which is Become a Provider podcast. And not only is he an amazing guy to follow and go listen to his podcast, because it really is, it's such a sweet way that you interview people. And I remember I reviewed your show and was like, "Oh my gosh, I love how you interview people." Yes, yes. And so I am excited to welcome you to our show and to have the listeners hear you, and welcome.
Well, it's so sweet. Thank you for the introduction. And isn't it a labor of love to have a podcast? So it's fun to chat about the journey.
Yes, I know. And I think that we don't hear the backstory very often. And so I think it's helpful for other people to hear, oh, that's how they do it, or that's what they've tried. And then they've switched over to this. And why did they do that? And explaining all the back end things is so helpful for other people that are in a similar journey of producing a podcast and being a host.
Well, I can't wait to learn as well from your other guests that you've had. And congratulations. I know you've just crossed over 100 episodes of this podcast as well. So you've got a lot of lessons along the way. And it's fun to share some of mine today.
Yes, yes. So we're going to jump right in to our conversation on really what started you in this thought process of, I want to start a podcast, because many of my listeners today are in that position right now of, I'm thinking about starting a podcast, but I'm not sure if I want to start a podcast.
Yeah. So at this point, as we sit here today and have this chat, I've had probably about 115-ish episodes over about 3 years, and it hasn't been a linear journey. And so, like many of your clients and listeners, they're probably avid podcast listeners, and they are content creators in some form or fashion, serving others. And in the back of their mind, they may be like me. One day I'll do that podcast, and that's gonna be really fun. And so, like many people, I just was an early adopter to podcasters, where I followed several of them. And one year for Christmas, I did a little research, trying to think strategically, like what I really want for Christmas. So a few years back, I asked for a Shure mic and a
Yeah.
Zoom 6 recorder. Some other podcasters had recommended this simple setup, and not to be confused with the online streaming platform Zoom, but an actual recorder for in person. And so I asked for all this, got it, and then did nothing with it. It just took like a couple years, and I just sat in the back of my office here in a cabinet. And I guess it was something I thought I would enjoy doing. I appreciated it from a listener perspective, and it wasn't until the pandemic that I finally started it.
I love that. I think there's so many people that are still sitting in that same boat of, I've got my mic, I've got maybe what I want to talk about, and yet I have not launched yet.
Yeah.
So very, very similar stories for sure. Hmm.
Well, and that's the value of what you offer as a coach. And so for me, oddly enough, I think my training as a health and wellness coach has really primed me for being a podcast host. And I know you coach several podcast clients that might have a background as a coach. And I think that really serves them quite well,
Yeah.
because in that training as a coach, whether a life coach, health coach, business coach, an effective coach, I think a common theme would be listening
Hmm.
and being able to ask the right questions at the right time to unlock something in their clients that they haven't been able to do on their own. And that was a surprising bonus that I found was this random training in a different field that I thought had no relevance whatsoever to a podcast.
Mhm.
It was really helpful because I remember during my health coach training, we did this exercise where they paired us off and one person could only talk and the other person couldn't do anything. It was just a kind of visual cues that I'm listening and nodding the head, but you couldn't say anything. It was only for about 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes, and it felt like an eternity. And you just realize how often we interject and interrupt the flow of the conversation. And so that's something that I learned as an unexpected surprise that maybe some of the listeners, they think, well, yeah, maybe I've been a business professional or entrepreneur, and this whole podcasting thing is something that I want to do. I haven't, and we make up all these excuses. Well, I guess I would encourage them to think about how they might leverage their professional training up to this point could really make them a unique podcaster.
Oh, that's such a great point, Justin. I think I resonate with that immensely because I went to school for psychology, shifted to personal training, then became a podcast producer, and then became
Oh,
a
wow.
podcast host. So, who has a coaching certification. And in all of that, it really is learning to listen to the gold that is starting to bubble up in another person and pulling that out and really positioning yourself into such a sweet space with so many different human hearts over and over again and hearing what's going on within them. And whether you're
Mm.
an interview style or you're pulling that out of your own story and you're a solo podcaster, all of that is extremely valuable to bring those outside tools into the conversation.
And you put it so well, the sweet spots where I have benefited tremendously just by having a podcast allows me an excuse to connect with people that I genuinely want to learn from. And so that's another reason to go ahead and start your podcast is that you are giving others in your sphere of influence an opportunity to share in a way that they may not have without your podcast.
Mhm.
So there's several interviews that I've done with family members, and I consider that something of a legacy, and I'm so thankful to have recorded and produced, and we wouldn't have had that probably without the podcast. So that's another bonus that I think a lot of us don't think about when we consider starting a podcast is
Mhm.
it's such a gift to other people. It genuinely is. When if you're doing it out of something that is a passion of yours and you're excited about, and I'm happy to share, like, it's been a windy road of figuring out, like, who's my audience and, like, what tools am I using? But at the end of the day, I always was excited to have a podcast.
Mhm.
And while I may not have had the perfect story brand type of framework and consistency all along the way, I've learned and I've grown. And I think that's part of the journey as well. So, all that to say is that I think that the benefit of starting a podcast, it goes beyond just yourself as the host or maybe even growing your business, but to give your audience, to give your guests on the show an opportunity to reach people that they wouldn't have without you. And you just need to start this thing.
Yes, it is a tremendous gift to know just the lives that we have the potential to impact and be a part of. I mean, gosh, that could be a whole episode in itself is the impact of our words and the legacy that it is leaving. I think that's so beautiful that you interviewed some of your family to have that too as a gift for generations to come to hear not only like you think about people who write a book, right? And
Mm.
that is forever. You can have that access I would assume. But then there's like a whole different dynamic when you hear their voice. And I think about so my dad passed away in 2015, and I know you have a similar journey
Mhm.
and part of why you started your podcast. My dad, if I would have recorded his voice and how to build a broadcast company, because that was his story. He built a broadcast company from the ground up. And dang, I wish I had that recording. What a legacy to have in the cadence of his voice, the sound of his voice. it is a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Yeah, capturing the audio, you're right, it is, and having the podcast allows you to do that, and as I mentioned, it gave me the excuse to reach out to people that I would have never reached out to
Right.
before, whether they're well known or not well known, and, sharing other people's stories is really nice to give that as a gift, and there's a level of responsibility as a podcast host as well, where you want to it's this beautiful tension of you want to be prepared and at the same time be in the moment, right? It's like that's when the magic happens where you do the best you can. You are strategic about what podcast am I starting? Who's my audience? The tools that you're using to make it as simple as possible, editing it, making it as pleasurable as possible for the audience. And you put in this work and effort, but then you don't wanna be so wrapped up in, like, here's the flow of the questions that I have to go through, in my opinion. Now,
Mhm.
everyone's podcast is different. In my opinion, it's the preparation allows you the flexibility to then go where the energy is during the podcast interview.
Yes. Oh, totally agree. 100%. Like, going with that flow is so important of navigating, "Ooh, there's something right there that my people need to hear." And yep, I agree 100% on that. Okay, I'm gonna go back a little bit because I think it's important to hear what was that turning point for you when you finally were like, "Yes, I'm gonna press record and start a podcast."
So the first episode, I try to make as easy on myself as possible where I invited a dear friend and mentor. So oftentimes if you're doing a podcast interviewing guests, you think, well, who's going to be my first guest, right? And so
Mhm,
it's that practical first step. So I made it easy on myself to invite someone that knew and loved me and would do a great job and knew that this was my first podcast recording. So it lowered the barrier of entry
mm,
and helped me just be more at peace and calm because this person genuinely knew me, as I said. So I picked my high school basketball coach, who we've kept in touch with all these years. And it was a great conversation because even before I had the clarity that I do now with become a provider, the message is to help encourage Christians to provide like Jesus in their lives. And when I first started it, it was a little bit more open, like, hey, let's just provide, let's be good people.
mhm.
And looking back at the first episode, it was actually a perfect person to have because he just went straight to the message saying, well, I mean, Jesus is the ultimate provider. So we just needed to accept his provision and do that for others. And I'm so thankful that without realizing my audience and the clear message, it was more amorphous and a little bit
Mm.
broader. He just went straight to the heart. And so that helped me. And also I acknowledged in the first episode that this was my first episode. And we even joked at the end of the conversation as I was wrapping it up. I said, Coach, how should I end these podcasts? What do you think's a good question? And he gave me one that I use to this day. So we talked about how there's that beautiful tension of preparing and then also being in the moment. So this is one of those moments of trying to be authentic and vulnerable and saying, I have this all nailed down at this point. And so now with my podcast, I've got these two bookends of, I know how I'm going to start my opening question and then I know how I'm going to end. And thanks to his feedback, he said, well, gosh, as you have people on the show, it would be really interesting. How are they providing for themselves? And I thought
Ooh,
that's a great question,
oh,
because I'm interviewing these professionals along the theme of all the great work they're doing and the fun moments in their lives where Jesus really showed up in a dramatic way sometimes that changed the trajectory of their life and their career. And that's just a moment of diving into it with somebody that I knew and trusted, and they gave back to me by just being themselves and being authentic and
mhm.
giving me that gem of a question that I use to this day.
I love that. I think you offer so much there. Is one, finding something that will make you comfortable with your first episode. And I do this offer in my boot camp, which is basically a cohort of launching women through the podcast process of launching their first episode. And I offer, hey, do you want me to interview you on your first episode? Because so many of them
That's so
have
good.
this hiccup of like, "Oh, it's just so hard to just press record." And when you're not used to just talking and letting it rip, then
Yeah.
you need somebody there to pull out those questions. And I love that. that you asked your high school coach to come and that you still call him coach. That's so awesome. But there's again, it's that authenticity of pressing record. You're
Mhm.
doing it you're doing it in a way that is pulling on a strength of I do better with connection with other people, and I can answer their questions, and I can be really authentic and real and say, "Hey, how do I wrap up these episodes?" I love that you have that real conversation in the midst of your episode. Ah, so good. Okay, you are now how many years in to podcasting?
Yeah, over 3 years now.
So over 3 years. So you are a seasoned podcaster for sure. Have you seen, because you mentioned the ups and downs and the turning and the curving and all of that. Have you seen where you have maybe honed in a little bit more on your specific person and your specific message, and how have you gone about doing that?
It was a little bit embarrassing because it wasn't until after episode 100 that I knew what I was doing, meaning I felt more confident with who I was speaking to, why I had this podcast, and what's the end goal. So, just to encourage your listeners, like if you haven't started a podcast, I mean, I'm an example of someone, it took 100 episodes to really feel like, all right, I know who I'm doing this for, right? So, be okay with rebranding. And so, here's what I mean by that is when I started the podcast in the pandemic, as I mentioned, I'm a coach, I'm an entrepreneur, and I've started this Christian nonprofit as well after the life and legacy of my father. And so I had all these things going on, and I started the podcast. And at first, one of the tweaks that I've recently made after 100 episodes was I realized this podcast is part of the ministry of the nonprofit. I'm not
Mm,
seeking to develop a personal coaching business from this, which I thought I was. And it was a little bit embarrassing where I'm thinking to myself, well, I don't know. I mean, I've been doing this for a while. It seems like in your terms, you're right. Like 3+ years in the podcast world as a seasoned podcaster,
mhm,
there seems to be you get 5 episodes, and there's so many podcasts that just don't make it.
mhm,
People fizzle out, and they need a coach like you to help them clarify this in the beginning. So I would say, quite honestly and candidly, after that 100 episodes, this light bulb went off to know I'm doing this podcast to help encourage Christians to provide like Jesus. This is the exact mission of my
mhm,
nonprofit. So let's fold this underneath that umbrella. And it revived the podcast for me, actually. It made me more excited about it.
mhm,
And so that's one encouragement to your listeners is that if the excitement and the energy goes away after starting it, kind of lean into that to ask the questions of why is that? And is it because I know something isn't an alignment here
mhm,
where I'm doing this and on the one hand, I'm enjoying the interviews, I'm unlocking some great relationships and some knowledge in my own life and hopefully for others. But there's something amiss here. And my call to action at the end was like, well, sign up for my newsletter. And then, well, what's the purpose of the newsletter? And it was just like I was checking the boxes of got the podcast, got the newsletter, got the website, and then there wasn't a clarity of like, why am I doing this?
yes,
And so the point of the story is that even after launching your podcast, it's okay to pivot and to change based on your life and professional goals. And since I've done that, it's really energized me and it's helped me identify the right types of guests to welcome to the podcast, to be excited about, so that when people enter my podcast, it's a safe place. They know what to expect.
mhm,
And hopefully, this is the moment where it helps me get to the next phase of growth with the podcast and
yeah,
refining it. And I think that's part of the lesson learned here as well, that I thought that you would have this figured out in episodes 1 through 5 versus episodes 100 through 105.
yes. I couldn't agree more with that. There's something about the 100 episodes, and this is well, right now, as we're recording, this is called holistic podcasting. That's and I am in the midst of a rebrand. So by the time this airs, I already have the name. Thank you, Jesus, for bringing that clarity ahead of time. But it is so true. I mean, this is my third now launched podcast, and there is something that kind of clicks in about 100 episodes in where you're like, "Oh, this is really where I wanting to go." But I think there's actually a whole learning and wisdom and refining that happens in those 100 episodes that even if you get clarity coaching by me, because that is my passion, is to set up people well with their message and get real clear on their content,
Mhm.
what they're doing, how their vision moving forward. But our vision is constantly changing. I mean, it's like, I picture, that the picture of Jesus, like, every step it lights up, boom, 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 like a music almost like light up, as you go, and I feel like that's how it is with podcasting when you're taking steps and you're like, "Oh, it's getting a little clearer. Oh, it's getting a little clear. Next step. Oh, it's really clear now who I am called to serve and who is coming to the table to listen and to put those AirPods in and
Mhm.
allow me time and space to be inside of the brain." So, yes, it is such a journey.
There's a couple things that come to mind with that. Thank you for sharing that because you think, "Well, I'm a coach, and how can I change and rebrand and rename this?" And it seems so big to you, and it did seem so big to me to all of a sudden shift from at the end of the episode to say, "Oh, go to my personal website," to then say, "Oh, go to the nonprofit website." That was a
Mm,
big deal for me, but to the outside looking in, it's the same thing. Like, people don't notice that, and they'll find you, and they're already following you, but it weighs heavy on us, and I think that can be something to address. Like,
yeah.
this is a big deal to me, but really, in the grand scheme of things, it's not. And so just move forward with it. And if it helps you as the podcast host and creator to get clarity and to feel more excited about it and to help you grow, then just go for it. And it's not as if people are going to be pointing the finger at you saying, like, oh, this isn't right for you to do this at all. So to being willing to grow and to change, I think, that's a beautiful example of that as well. And I think another bonus is that by hosting your own podcast and starting it makes you a better guest. You just have an appreciation for what it takes to
Mhm.
set this up and to host a conversation, to edit it, to publish it, and to do that well. And I think if part of your business is to share a message, to grow as a thought leader, then funny enough, starting a podcast will actually equip you to be a better guest, I believe.
Oh, I could not agree more with that of just having those conversation skills being more and more developed and oh, yeah, yeah, that's so good. And I think what you said too, I want to reiterate is the alignment of finding that alignment you had mentioned, really understanding like your heart was the ministry and this to be a part of that and having the alignment there and pointing people towards the nonprofit. I think that's so important. And again, it's another one of those things that we really try to hone in at the very beginning of what is the alignment factor. So if you're a coach, and you have a heart for, say, overwhelmed moms who have very little kids or something, that your podcast is in alignment with that very passion and desire that God's already laid on your heart. And we step into that. So it'd be like somebody who is called to do that, and then they start a podcast on maybe business finance, or you're like, "Wait, what? You're so passionate about this," or you watch their eyes light up when they start talking about a specific thing. Like, that's the sweet spot and the alignment that we're talking about here. Yeah.
Because you need energy to continue this. I mean, you're gonna have to go back to that well over and over again of, "Oh, I just love talking about whatever it is." I mean,
Yeah.
coaching women or growing businesses, whatever it might be. It sounds so simple, but at the same time, you just have to challenge yourself. Like, could you talk about this for 2 years? And
Mhm.
if the answer to that is no, then that's probably an indicator that what you're think you wanna host a podcast on is just a current excitement, and I do this often, like, I think, "Oh, I'm gonna start this type of newsletter or offer this. I'm really excited about it. I've learned it a little bit," and maybe it's a little bit of hubris, like, "Oh, I can just then become an expert in this," and so you have to watch out for that. Like, is this just a current thing that you as a learner enjoy?
Mhm.
And to challenge yourself to say, "Could I really talk about this for a couple years?" And I think that's a good litmus test to
Mhm.
identify if you're on the right track or not.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying too is that it requires patience in this whole process of this is a slow building patience building, consistent thing that you were hitting over and over and over again. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it is very humbling when you have a goal of having a podcast, maybe a weekly basis, and how quickly that happens. And you think, the importance of processes and systems, and happy to go into some of the tools that I've used in the past that have served me well, and those that haven't with it. But it certainly is an ambitious goal to start a podcast, but with the right coaching and there's great tools out there, totally
Mhm.
doable. You just have to commit to it and be willing to be patient with it. And I think that's part of the journey, as you mentioned, with it.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. You mentioned it, and we are all about systems that work. So in this over 3 years of podcasting, I would love for you to share the systems that you're finding that are working for you.
Sure. So nailing down your ideal guest is super important, and making them feel truly respected and wanted on the show when you do the invitation to say, "Hey, this is what my podcast is about." It's almost like having your elevator pitch, like copy and paste, but then make it specific to the person to just get them genuinely excited and honored to be on the podcast. I think is super helpful. And I didn't have that before. I was just doing that every single time. And finally, I'm like, I need to have just a template invitation, and it helped me to clarify, all right, my podcast, become a provider, provide like Jesus. I think you're doing this really well. Would you like to share your story on my podcast? Here's how I think you've provided for me. Either I've consumed your content kind of offline, or we have a personal relationship. And that way they know that this is a genuine experience of this guy wants to talk to me. So I think
Mhm.
that would be a nice step in a process that took me too long to come up with, was that nice template invitation to know who you want to go after. And then also like dream big, because speaking of dream big, I got the author Bob Goff to be on my podcast, who
Amazing.
wrote Dream Big and Love Does and those shows. And it's just like making the ask. You never know. And being willing, as one of my friends told me, he said, Justin, I'm just okay with rejection at this point in my life and my career.
Mhm.
And I just love that statement, because I believed it. I mean, it was true, whether in sales or recruiting guys for small groups or starting this or that. I've seen that in his life, and I think you have to have that template invitation and then
Yeah.
be okay with rejection while dreaming big and asking for people that would serve your audience really well. And they can sense that, even if it's an email or a DM, or better yet, just a, personal connection with it. So that's a process that I've been improving on and expanding with. And so I'm excited about 2024 to hone in on that as well. And then I just simply use Calendly. Like, that's been amazing. Calendly, the tool to schedule when the podcast happens. So I try to, do that so that the process is a lot easier. That's a tool that's been super practical as well. That links up with my Zoom account or whatever you want to use with it. And all that is nice. And then I've got a link to the podcast so they can, if they want to, listen to previous episodes to get a sense of my style. And I tell them in the invitation, here's some sample questions. As I mentioned, for me, what's helpful is I know my opening question and I know my ending question.
Yeah.
And then in between, we just see where the magic happens. And I invite them to share as much or as little as they want beforehand. But I just like to have a real conversation. So that's a little bit of the process of getting the guests, preparing them, and then in the interview, I really try to honor, if they had hired me as a coach, what's the level of attention that I want to give to them. So
Mm.
if they have hired me as a personal coach, I need to be fully present and make sure that I'm delivering my best to them as much as I can.
Yeah.
There are things that happen from the technology side and life side, and you just have to deal with it as a podcast host, and you have to have your go-to, what I call priming techniques, to put you in the best mental, physical state that you can possibly be in, and give yourself a chance. Actually
Yeah.
be thoughtful. We're not machines, and so priming how we can be at our best is super important. And it could be some practical things, like the process that I have is, like before getting on here, I actually called my mom to put me in a positive mindset and to get my voice like as an authentic voice versus
Yeah.
pretending to have this kind of fake professional voice. So talking to mom beforehand certainly does that for me. And then I listen to like a song or two that puts me in a good mood. And so for me personally, those are examples of priming before having a podcast interview, to try my best to set the stage. And typically, some practical things too. Have like cup of tea and some water,
Mhm.
and if all else fails, like I said, you've got your beginning question, your end question, and you're good to go, right? When it comes to that, and I try to set the guest and myself at ease to tell them, hey, this can be recorded. So start a story. If it doesn't work out, we'll edit that out. Like I'm here to serve you.
Mm.
So go as deep as you feel that you want to. We can always edit it out later. It takes the pressure off them, takes the pressure off
Yeah.
me a little bit as well. And so that's a little of the process, the onboarding process. And then I can go into how I do editing and promotion. But let me pause there. Is there any questions with that on your side?
I think that's great. I mean, going from the very beginning of really, again, talking about alignment, finding a guest that is really going to be helpful for your audience is of utmost importance. One thing that I've seen is that people will just have guests to fill spots and,
Yeah.
ugh, man, it just, like, I wanna go and, like, organize it for them or ask
Don't
them.
do that.
Right? Like, okay, we gotta be intentional about who we're asking to come on our show, and,
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I have professional like agencies contacting me now, which is a great honor, right? And I think it's
yeah,
because so many podcasts don't make it past 5 or 10 or whatever the numbers are. It's kind of like a business, like half startups are going to be failed after 5 years, whatever the latest is.
yep,
And the same is true with podcasts. And so I get these inquiries, these inbounds, and person sounds neat, but it has nothing to do. It's like, would you like to have John Smith, who's an expert in this field? What I've started to do is now, just like I have a template with
mhm,
my invitation to guests, I've now got a template response to those agencies to say, hey, if this person, if my message of the following resonates with this person in a way that you haven't described in this bio, let me know and happy to explore further.
brilliant,
And so that's a way that I'm not trying to close the door completely. I'm just giving them an opportunity to say, oh, well, that is part of my journey or not. And so far, no one has come back with anything. It's just like it feels like, a bot invitation of
yep,
this agency that's just trying to get the speaker some gigs with it. So that just it kind of jolts my memory of like what you said was it's better to miss a week. Like it's a lot better to miss a week or a month or two than have a bad guess, meaning a bad alignment. And I've done that too. Like I've had to give myself permission. This summer was just a summer of reflection and travel for me. And at first I got really nervous, like, oh, I don't have a guest here. Should I just have something myself? Or should I try to like call up this person and do it last minute? And those are real emotions that come through because
mhm,
you want to achieve your goals. But I would certainly agree with you, Kristen, that it's much better to miss a week or two than
yeah,
have a guest that doesn't align with your audience or has an appreciation for your mission. It's just not worth it.
yes, agree, agree, and I love your response of the email because I just ignore them, which actually is probably not a good thing because you wanna keep that door open, like you said,
Mm.
Justin, of just, "Okay, well, I'm gonna respond back with this template email of, are you in alignment with what I want to bring to my audience? And if so, let's hop on a 15-minute pre-interview phone call and talk about what we could specifically talk about that's going to bring value to you and to my listeners." So I like that. You're teaching me something here. So I received
Oh,
that.
good. I'm glad.
Oh, yeah, and then the Calendly, be okay with rejection. I love that you include your link to your podcast in your Calendly. That's
Mhm.
brilliant because, yes, most people that are booking on each other's show to have that little easy access, I mean, anything to make the process simpler and more accessible of like, "Yep, oh, I'm gonna go listen to this episode right now so that I can prepare for this interview," is that's brilliant. Great idea.
Well, thanks. It's only taken 115 episodes to come up with a process here. Like we said, a few years with it, and so I don't know if it's helpful to then talk about like what happens after the episode with tools. Would you
Yep.
like me to go into that a little bit?
Yeah. Let's go for afterwards. What happens?
Okay. So here's a little thing that I learned the importance of too. As a novice podcaster, one of the critical components is your audio quality, and something that everyone should do is make sure that when you're recording, the two audio tracks are separate. That
Mhm.
is a game changer. And I
Yeah.
didn't realize a simple setting in Zoom or whatever recording software you're using, you just have to dive a little bit deep into those settings. And that is my I wish I would have known. day one of being a podcaster was the importance of configuring that audio setting for you and your guest to have two separate audio tracks so that you can mute one while you edit the other. That's huge. And
Yeah.
so, regardless if you're editing it or if you're outsourcing it to someone else, you need to give them the best chance of success. And so, as I said, I came into this just with I was just a fan of podcasts and had a desire to share my message. No training in this whatsoever. I get into it, and then I think, "Well, I'll just edit that out," and you realize, "Oh, man, I didn't click the button I needed to click, and all this audio is overlaid on one another." So, that's something I learned. You wanna have the 2 separate audio tracks, and then for me personally, I just dove into Audacity, which I know you have experience with, and so that's an open source tool that I educated myself on, and that was helpful to do, where I kinda just set the bar low to say, "I'm just using audio, let me edit this," and that was helpful and allowed me to listen to myself. So I'm really thankful that I took on the editing in the beginning because it forced myself to listen to myself.
Yeah.
And I realized that I have a tendency to just talk too fast. And so I have to really coach myself to say, okay, talk slower, talk slower. You're by default, we all have a natural cadence. And so that was really helpful almost to coach myself. And I
Mhm.
think that was an unexpected bonus of taking on the responsibility of editing, where it forced me to do that, gave me an appreciation for having two separate audio tracks, learning the basics of Audacity, and then I burnt myself out at episode 40. I did an ambitious project where I said, it'd be great to celebrate 40 episodes. I don't know why I thought 40 was such a great time to do this. I'm going to do like little clips of every single episode leading up to that. And I did all that myself. And afterwards I said, I'm not doing this anymore. This is crazy. I need to outsource this. And so I did. And I used another company for a few episodes, and then I guess I just got a little bit antsy on the sidelines and I took it back. And then I outsourced it again using someone finding, just on Upwork. And at the moment, I'm experimenting with Descript
Mhm.
as an audio tool that has some really interesting artificial intelligence features where it can automatically remove some filler words and shorten some dead space as well. And so I enjoy that. But if you don't enjoy editing, Eh, don't worry about it. Like, there's so many companies doing this, and it's probably my if you outsource the editing from the beginning, my encouragement is make sure that you're listening to yourself and
Mhm.
not just assuming that you heard yourself during the interview, because just like back in the day when voicemail was a thing, you'd record your voicemail, you'd listen to it, and you think, "Who's that person? Like, do I really sound like
Right.
that?" It's weird how our ears are with that. So, all that said, the tools that I've used have been Audacity, have been outsourcing it, using professional companies or finding freelancers myself, or Descript, or a combination of all of that to serve me well in the style that I like editing.
Mhm.
And I think you can over edit too. So that's a journey I've had to learn. And fortunately, I've got my wife to tell me, "Oh, I could tell, like, that was way too much editing. It was too obvious," where he was immediately answering a question right after you asked it. And so I had to grow in that too. Like, there's too much editing and over editing where you want it to be a natural conversation. And I'm just trying to make them sound as clear as possible so it's not a distraction with it. And so that's another lesson learned as well. And just lastly, just promoting it. I use Headline or Headliner as a nice tool to use use just audio clips in a visual format, and a designer helps me to make the thumbnails that I really enjoy. Like, for some reason, I've been totally fine like outsourcing the design of it, and then I've held on probably too tightly with the audio editing. But I love just asking the guest for an image and then sending that to the designer. They design something beautiful for all the social media platforms with the thumbnails and the previews. And then I've got a template that I use for like a little 30-second click or clip. And I just want to bless the guest too. Like, I want them to feel like, once again, I'm honoring the time with them as if they've hired me as their professional coach, and they're getting something of value at the end of the day so I can promote it, tag them with it. I think that's it. Those are the tools that I use to kind of, make the podcast, edit the podcast, and have it there. And as far as distribution goes, I started with Anchor FM to host my
Yeah.
podcast, and now that's part of like Spotify for podcasters. So
Mhm.
those are the tools I use.
Awesome. Wow, thank you for sharing that. I think like I said at the beginning, it's so helpful to hear other podcasters' systems and figuring out, okay, I enjoy editing or I don't enjoy editing, and knowing that there is value in hearing your own voice. Because I know there are some women that I help edit their podcasts, and they don't ever want to hear themselves. They just wanna record it, send to me, and be done with it, and I get it. I totally get it, and man, we gotta grow. We gotta look at ourselves and be like, "Ooh, I say and so." Very much. That is mine. Mine, o over and over again is that, where it's an intentional, "Okay, I cannot say and so."
This is going back to that tension as a podcast host is that you want to raise the bar of quality
Mhm.
where it comes across as you care about this project and people listening know that, "Oh, Kristen really cares about this project that she's doing." While at
Yeah.
the same time, you're not frozen in a corner scared to death to press record, right? And there's this, like, tension, and it's just, like, leaning into that, and I think you bring up a good point of people should be in the mindset of as a growth mindset as a podcast host to always be improving, and one of the most popular podcasts, especially early on, was Tim Ferriss, and I listened to an episode where he said he actually, hired a coach to review the first X number of episodes and to give written feedback of the flow of it. And that really stuck with me to because I would have thought, as many podcasters would, oh, I'm finally done. I've got that episode out. Let's go to the next one. There's so much work to be done. But to have the courage to listen to yourself and to take notes is super valuable, and I continue to refine how I host and ask questions. So I'd encourage people to lean into that really uncomfortable moment of actually listening to your podcast.
Yes. I love that you brought that up about Tim Ferriss. I actually just had my own personal podcast coach. He listened to an episode, and there's a new program out called Note Takers, I believe, but you put the
Mm,
audio in, and then he's writing comments on the actual audio line. So I
wow.
can see his comments as it goes. And number 1, so valuable to have somebody else listen in and be like, "Hey,
Mhm,
you know what? You started with this comment and then trailed off in a whole different world." So follow up with that. But one of the things that he mentioned that I'll share with you and with our listeners is when we have a guest, to make sure we wrap it up with a the takeaways, like what are our takeaways personally,
mm,
and to bring it back into, this is our show right here. This is our community, and you're coming into our community. And yes, it's an honor to have a guest on the show like you, Justin, and to be in a place of holding the takeaways for our people. We are the through vessel, right? Of like, okay, this is what we heard today. This is what I would love for you to walk away with. So anyway, I just thought that was really interesting.
I love that because you wanna make it as simple as possible, as we've talked about, as simple as possible for your guests and as
Mhm.
simple as possible for yourself to have a process in place so that you can sustain the effort of having a podcast, and as simple as possible for your listeners. I love that, like, at the end to say, "What have we talked about today?" Or, "Here's some of the things that I'm taking away from the conversation." I love that. So, yeah, thank
Yeah.
you for sharing.
Yes. I feel like I could talk to you for hours about your journey, and everyone would benefit from it because you are so well spoken and just honest with where you've come in your journey. And so, gosh, it has been a joy to hear your journey. But I want to make sure that people know about your podcast, and I wanted to ask a question with your become a provider. When you say provider, what does that word itself mean to you?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question because it's really important to me. And
Mm,
there's certain terms, such as provider, that have immediate connotations for people. And when I say provider, we define it very simply as provider equals bless plus protect. So
mm,
bless
mm.
plus protect is being a provider. And when we do both those things well, meaning that we are manifesting those characteristic traits in our lives of blessing ourselves and others, protecting ourselves and others, then we are a provider. And there's so many ways of taking those lessons. And that's why I love the podcast, because that's how I present it to my guests. And it allows them to really think of, oh, what's a moment that I've been blessed and protected, or I've done that for others. So when I say the word provider, that's what I mean. And then I make sure that I go back to, just like I shared, my first guest helped me to clarify this, that Jesus is our ultimate provider. He showed us the best example of blessing and protecting. And I get to interview people that are showing us these practical examples to inspire us to do the same, and how they've done it in their unique lens and career and all of that. So, because of that, the show is called Become a Provider. That's a little bit of the background. And the reason that word means so much to me is because when my father passed away, we had a wake in his honor. So I had an opportunity to prepare some brief remarks. And I imagine, you know, many of us are at probably a place in our life and careers where either we have aging grandparents or parents, and we're all going to lose our parents at one stage or another. And it unfortunately is just a reality of this life. And so for me, it came at a kind of unexpected time. And, you go into work on a Monday, and all of a sudden on a Thursday, you're standing up in front of family and friends remarking on the life of your late father. So through that challenge of trying to synthesize the lessons and the legacy that I was trying to take from my father, the word provider just came
Mm,
out. It was like, this is it. And I was trying my best to just come up with one takeaway, one word. And that was the word that I honed in on. And so that was back in 2017. And since that time, that word has meant a tremendous amount to me, to take that word and try to implement it in my life every day. And it's been amazing to see what's happened since that time, where because that reflection and maybe that Holy Spirit moment, I've taken that word, and my wife and I have created the CL Thomas Fellowship, which is a nonprofit that helps just provide free resources to encourage Christians to provide like Jesus, through the
mm.
podcast, the newsletter, and also small groups that we host. And it's just been an amazing journey, something that I try to lean into, and it's very personal to me. So I hope that comes across as why that word means something to me, and how we've defined it to encourage others to lean into that journey of becoming a provider.
Yeah, such a beautiful foundation to your podcast. And you can tell that it is truly an identity piece, a kingdom identity. And that is paving the way of your mission and your purpose through
Hmm.
this vessel of podcasting. I am honored to have you here and for you to share your podcasting journey and sharing with our audience. And it's going to be helpful for so many. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
This has been a pleasure, Kristen. Thank you so much for the work you're doing and inviting me to share with your listeners as well. So, if I can help in any way, just let me know. And this podcast has provided for me. And so, you've met the qualifications. I would like to invite you as a guest on my show. And so, let's make sure to make that happen soon.
Absolutely. I would love it. Thanks for listening today. Hey, I want you to know that there is an opportunity for you and I to connect. I would love to do that. Find a link below and we can schedule a one-on-one free 15-minute consultation. I want to hear, where are you in your podcasting journey, and how can I help serve you and help you bring that kingdom impact dream into reality?